The fog rolled in thick that night, settling like a suffocating blanket over the town. I had always hated the fog. It distorted the world, blurred edges, and brought a creeping sense of unease. But this night was different. The fog carried with it something else, something far more sinister. I had just finished my shift at the diner and was making my way home. My apartment was only a 10-minute walk, but as soon as I stepped out into the misty streets, the usual sense of unease intensified into a palpable fear. The street lights, usually comforting beacons, were swallowed by the fog, their light barely piercing the dense gray. I walked briskly, my footsteps echoing unnaturally in the silent, shrouded street. Every few steps, I would glance over my shoulder, half expecting to see someone or something following me. The town was eerily quiet. Not a single car drove by, and no one else seemed to be out. It was as if the fog had swallowed the entire town, leaving me stranded in an empty, muted world. I was about halfway home when I heard the first sound, a faint rustling, like dry leaves scraping against the pavement. I stopped, straining my ears. The noise stopped too. I shook my head, convincing myself it was just the wind. But as I resumed walking, the rustling started again, louder this time. It was coming from behind me. I turned slowly, heart pounding. At first, I saw nothing but swirling gray. Then, out of the corner of my eye, I caught a glimpse of movement, a shadow darting between the fog-enshrouded trees. My breath hitched. I quickened my pace, the fear turning into a cold dread. The rustling grew louder, closer. It was no longer just leaves. There were soft, padding footsteps, and the occasional snap of a twig. I broke into a run, my pulse racing, eyes darting around wildly. My apartment was just a few blocks away. I just had to make it there. I didn't dare look back again, afraid of what I might see. As I rounded the corner onto my street, a chilling realization struck me. The footsteps had multiplied. There were several of them now, all around me, moving swiftly and silently through the fog. Panic surged through me. I sprinted the last few yards, my lungs burning, and fumbled with my keys at the door, desperate to get inside. I stumbled into my apartment, slamming the door shut behind me and double-locking it. For a moment, I leaned against the door, gasping for breath, trying to calm my racing heart. The silence inside was deafening. I listened intently, but the sounds outside had ceased. Had I imagined it all? I turned on every light in the apartment. The harsh brightness, a welcome contrast to the oppressive darkness outside. I walked to the window and peeked through the blinds. The fog pressed against the glass, thick and impenetrable. I could see nothing beyond it. Just as I began to relax, a shadow passed by the window, too close for comfort. I jumped back, heart hammering. There was no denying it now. Something was out there. I grabbed my phone, ready to call the police, but paused. What would I tell them? That I was being followed by shadows in the fog? They would think I was crazy. A soft tapping on the window sent a jolt of fear through me. I edged closer, peering out again. This time, I saw it clearly. A pale, gaunt face pressed against the glass, eyes black and soulless. It stared at me, unblinking, its breath fogging up the window. Behind it, more figures emerged from the mist, their outlines shifting and flickering as if they were not entirely solid. I stumbled back, phone clattering to the floor. The tapping turned into a scratching, nails dragging across the glass. The creatures outside seemed to be testing the barrier, looking for a way in. I knew the door wouldn't hold them for long if they decided to force their way in. In a panic, I retreated to my bedroom, barricading the door with whatever furniture I could move. I sat on the bed, clutching a kitchen knife, listening to the unnerving sounds from the other side of the apartment. The scratching grew more frantic, more insistent. And then, just as suddenly as it had begun, it stopped. Silence. Minutes passed, feeling like hours. I dared to hope that they had given up. I cautiously moved to the bedroom window and peeked outside. The fog was starting to lift, and with it, the shadows seemed to dissolve, fading back into the night. By morning, the fog had completely cleared. I ventured outside, exhausted and wary. The town looked normal, as if nothing had happened. I wanted to believe it was all a terrible nightmare, but the deep scratches on my window told a different story. I never spoke of that night to anyone. Who would believe me? But every time the fog rolls in, I feel that familiar dread. I stay inside, lights on, doors locked, praying the creatures don't return. Because I know, deep down, they're still out there, waiting for the fog to bring them back. The fog was a constant companion in our coastal town, but that night, it was different. Thicker, more suffocating, as if it had a purpose. I worked the late shift at the library, and by the time I locked up and stepped outside, the fog had already swallowed the streets. My car was parked a few blocks away, and I cursed myself for not parking closer. The fog wrapped around me, dampening sound and light. Streetlights turned into fuzzy orbs, barely illuminating the sidewalk. I could see no more than a few feet in front of me. As I walked, a strange sound reached my ears, a low, whispering murmur. I stopped, straining to listen. It seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere. A disembodied voice carried on the mist. I shook my head, trying to dismiss it as my imagination, but the whispering grew louder, more insistent. I quickened my pace, the sound of my footsteps echoing hollowly. The whispering followed, weaving through the fog. I couldn't make out any words, but the tone was unmistakable. A low, predatory cadence that sent shivers down my spine. The fog thickened further, obscuring even the streetlights. I felt a prickle of fear, my skin crawling. I glanced around, hoping to see another person, anyone, but the streets were deserted. The whispering seemed to be closing in, coming from just behind me. My car was just ahead, a dark shape barely visible through the haze. I broke into a run, the whispering now a cacophony of voices, all speaking at once. I fumbled for my keys, my hands trembling, and finally managed to unlock the door. I threw myself inside and locked the doors, breathing heavily. The whispering stopped abruptly, leaving an eerie silence. I sat there, trying to calm my racing heart. I told myself it was just the wind, just my imagination playing tricks on me. But deep down, I knew that wasn't true. As I started the car, headlights pierced the fog, revealing shadows that seemed to shift and move just beyond the beam. I pulled out of the parking spot, my eyes darting nervously to the rearview mirror. The fog seemed alive, swirling and pulsing with an unnatural energy. I drove slowly, the visibility so poor I could barely see the road. The whispering returned, seeping into the car, curling around me like a cold, invisible hand. I turned up the radio, trying to drown it out, but the static only made it worse. The voices grew louder, more urgent, until they were a roar in my ears. Panic took over. I floored the gas pedal, the car lurching forward. The fog closed in, the whispering turning into shrieks of rage. My headlights illuminated fleeting glimpses of gaunt, twisted figures lurking in the mist. Their eyes glowed with a malevolent light, their mouths open in silent screams. I could barely keep the car on the road, my vision swimming with terror. The figures pressed against the windows, their bony fingers scraping against the glass. I could feel their presence, a suffocating weight pressing down on me. I sped through the deserted streets, desperate to escape. The fog seemed to thicken further, a wall of gray that resisted my passage. The shrieking voices filled my head, drowning out my thoughts. I could see the figures out of the corner of my eye, always just at the edge of my vision. Finally, I burst out of the fog, the shrieking abruptly cut off. The road ahead was clear, the night calm and still. I pulled over, shaking uncontrollably, my breath coming in ragged gasps. The whispering had stopped, the fog receding behind me, like a living entity retreating into the shadows. I sat there for a long time, trying to make sense of what had happened. The scratches on the windows were the only evidence that it had been real. When I finally drove home, the town seemed eerily normal, as if the fog had never existed. I never spoke of that night, fearing no one would believe me. But every time the fog rolls in, I remember the whispering voices and the twisted figures that lurk within it. I stay inside, lights on, doors locked, praying that the fog doesn't come for me again. Because I know, in the depths of my soul, that the fog is alive, and it remembers. The fog rolled in from the sea like an invading army, dense and impenetrable. By the time my shift ended at the small coastal inn, it was impossible to see more than a few feet ahead. I zipped up my jacket and pulled my hood tight, preparing for the short but treacherous walk home. My route took me down a narrow, winding road that hugged the cliffs. On clear nights, the ocean view was breathtaking. But tonight, the fog obscured everything, turning the familiar path into a surreal landscape. I could barely make out the edge of the road, the drop to the rocky shore, a constant, invisible threat. I walked quickly, my footsteps muffled by the thick mist. The fog had an almost physical presence, wrapping around me like a damp, cold shroud. As I moved further away from the inn, the world grew eerily silent. Even the sound of the waves crashing against the cliffs seemed distant, muted. Halfway home, I heard it, a low, guttural growl that sent a chill down my spine. I stopped, straining to listen. The growl came again, closer this time, resonating through the fog. I turned slowly, peering into the swirling gray, but saw nothing. My heart pounded as I resumed walking, faster now. The growl followed, a deep, menacing rumble that echoed in the mist. I glanced over my shoulder, catching a fleeting glimpse of movement, a shadow shifting in the fog. Panic surged through me. I broke into a run, the sound of my footsteps merging with the growl. The road twisted and turned, each curve obscured by the fog. I stumbled, almost losing my footing, but kept moving. The growl grew louder, more insistent, and I could hear something massive crashing through the underbrush, following me. I didn't dare look back again. I reached a particularly sharp bend in the road, my breath coming in ragged gasps. As I rounded the corner, I saw it, a hulking figure emerging from the fog. It was like nothing I had ever seen, a grotesque amalgamation of shadow and flesh. Its body was vaguely humanoid, but distorted, elongated limbs, and a hunched back giving it an unnatural, monstrous appearance. Its eyes glowed with a sickly yellow light, piercing through the fog. They locked onto me, filled with a predatory intelligence. I froze, unable to move, as it let out another growl, a sound that vibrated through the ground beneath my feet. For a moment, we stood there, staring at each other. Then, it took a step forward, its movements fluid and disturbingly graceful. That broke my paralysis. I turned and ran, my legs burning with exertion. The creature's growl followed, a constant reminder that it was right behind me. I could see the faint glow of my house through the fog, a beacon of safety. I pushed myself harder, every muscle in my body screaming in protest. The creature's footsteps thundered in my ears, growing louder, closer. I could almost feel its hot breath on my neck. I reached my front door and fumbled with the keys, hands shaking uncontrollably. The growl was deafening now, the creature mere feet away. I could hear its labored breathing, the scrape of its claws on the pavement. I managed to unlock the door and threw myself inside, slamming it shut and locking it. For a moment, there was silence. Then, the creature roared, a sound of pure rage and frustration. The door shook as it slammed against it, the wood creaking under the impact. I backed away, heart pounding, and grabbed a heavy chair, wedging it under the doorknob. The pounding continued for what felt like an eternity, then stopped abruptly. I held my breath, straining to listen. There was a soft scraping sound, like claws dragging across the door, and then silence. I waited, every nerve on edge, but the creature did not return. I stayed up all night, too terrified to sleep, clutching a kitchen knife as if it could protect me. The fog outside slowly began to lift with the dawn, revealing a world that looked deceptively normal. But I knew better. I knew what lurked in the fog. I never saw the creature again, but the memory of that night haunts me. The scratches on my front door are a constant reminder. Whenever the fog rolls in, I lock my doors and windows, lights blazing, and pray that the monster doesn't return. Because I know it's still out there, somewhere in the mist, waiting for another chance to strike.